The day started like any other for Sarah, a seasoned flight attendant who had spent over 10 years perfecting her craft in the skies. Her job wasn't just about serving meals or handing out blankets. It was about creating an experience, ensuring that every passenger felt welcomed, comfortable, and cared for. Today, she was assigned to a long-haul international flight from Los Angeles to London, one of the busiest routes on the airline's schedule. The cabin buzzed with excitement as passengers trickled in, some eager to reunite with loved ones, others ready to explore new cities or close deals in foreign lands. Sarah stood near the entrance of the plane, greeting travelers with her signature warm smile. She wore her uniform proudly, a crisp navy blue dress paired with polished shoes, and carried herself with the poise that came from years of practice. As first-class passengers began boarding, she noticed a man walking down the jet bridge. He was tall and broad-shouldered, exuding a quiet confidence that made him stand out even among the well-dressed crowd. His name was Carl Weathers, not his real name, but let's call him that for simplicity, and he had purchased a last-minute upgrade to first class. Little did Sarah know, this seemingly ordinary passenger would soon become the center of an extraordinary situation. Carl strode into the plane, nodding politely at Sarah as he passed by. He didn't strike her as particularly friendly, nor did he seem rude. If anything, he appeared preoccupied, perhaps thinking about whatever awaited him at their destination. He found his seat near the window, stowed his carry-on bag in the overhead compartment, and settled in without much fuss. At first glance, there was nothing remarkable about him, but if anyone had taken the time to ask, they might have discovered that Carl was no stranger to high-profile connections. In fact, he happened to be the stepfather of none other than Vin Diesel, the action star whose movies dominated box offices worldwide. Of course, Sarah had no way of knowing this. To her, Carl was simply another traveler looking forward to enjoying the perks of flying first class. As more passengers boarded, Sarah continued her routine duties, ensuring everything was in order before takeoff. She double-checked seat assignments, handed out welcome drinks, and answered questions about meal options. Everything seemed to be running smoothly until Carl caught her attention again. This time, it wasn't because of anything dramatic. He was simply reclining his seat all the way back. While this wasn't unusual behavior for first-class passengers, it became problematic when the person seated directly behind him complained. The woman in the row behind Carl was petite, her knees practically brushing against the back of his seat. With a polite but firm tone, she leaned forward and tapped him on the shoulder. "Excuse me," she said. "Do you think you could adjust your seat? It's pressing into my legs." Carl turned around slowly, his expression unreadable. For a moment, it looked like he might comply, but then he shrugged and replied, "Sorry, ma'am. I paid for this seat and I'm entitled to use it however I want." Sarah heard the exchange and decided to intervene. Approaching Carl with her usual calm demeanor, she knelt beside his seat and spoke softly. "Sir, I understand you're within your rights to recline your seat, but we do encourage our passengers to consider those around them. Would you mind adjusting it slightly for the comfort of the passenger behind you?" Carl glanced at her, his brow furrowing. "Look," he said, his voice tinged with irritation. "I've already told her I'm not doing anything wrong. If she has a problem, maybe she should have bought a better seat." His response took Sarah aback. She wasn't used to such resistance, especially from someone traveling in first class where customers typically appreciated the premium service. Still, she maintained her composure. "I completely understand, sir," she replied diplomatically. "But we aim to ensure everyone has a pleasant journey. Could we find a compromise here?" Carl hesitated for a second before reluctantly raising his seat a few inches. The woman behind him offered a grateful smile, and Sarah thanked Carl for his cooperation. Yet, despite resolving the issue temporarily, something lingered in the air between them, an unspoken tension that neither could quite shake off. Over the next hour, Sarah kept a watchful eye on Carl. He didn't cause any further disturbances, but his body language suggested he was growing increasingly agitated. When meal service began, Sarah approached his seat once more, holding a tray with a selection of gourmet dishes. "Can I interest you in our roast chicken or vegetarian pasta today, sir?" she asked brightly. Carl barely looked up from his phone. "Just bring me whatever's faster," he muttered, clearly unimpressed. Sarah nodded and moved on, making a mental note to check on him later. Meanwhile, the rest of the cabin hummed along peacefully. Passengers enjoyed their meals, sipped champagne, and chatted quietly. Outside, the sky stretched endlessly, dotted with wisps of clouds that glowed golden in the late afternoon sun. Despite the minor hiccup earlier, Sarah felt confident that the remainder of the flight would proceed without incident. After all, these kinds of interactions were part of the job. They came with the territory of working in customer service at 35,000 feet. But as fate would have it, the calm was short-lived. Unbeknownst to Sarah, the seeds of conflict had already been planted. What started as a simple disagreement over a reclined seat would soon spiral into something far more complicated, leaving both her and Carl grappling with consequences neither could have anticipated. For now, though, the plane soared onward, carrying its passengers closer to their destination and unknowingly hurtling toward a story that would captivate headlines around the world. As the flight continued, the initial tension between Sarah and Carl simmered beneath the surface, neither fully resolved nor entirely forgotten. The first-class cabin, usually a serene oasis of luxury and calm, began to feel slightly charged, with an undercurrent of unease. Passengers chatted quietly, sipped their drinks, and adjusted their seats. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She had dealt with difficult passengers before, people who were tired, stressed, or simply having a bad day. But there was something about Carl's demeanor that made her uneasy. It wasn't just his curt responses or his refusal to compromise. It was the way he carried himself as if he were above the rules that governed everyone else. A little while later, the situation took another turn. After finishing his meal, Carl decided to rummage through his carry-on bag in the overhead compartment. He stood up abruptly, not bothering to check if anyone was walking behind him. At that exact moment, a flight attendant carrying a tray of empty glasses was passing by. Startled by Carl's sudden movement, she stumbled slightly, nearly dropping the tray. Though no harm was done, the clatter drew attention from nearby passengers. Some turned their heads curiously, while others exchanged knowing glances. Sarah, hearing the commotion, hurried over to assess the situation. "Sir," she said gently, addressing Carl, "please be mindful when moving around the cabin. We want to ensure everyone's safety." Her tone was polite but firm, the kind of professionalism she had honed over years of experience. Carl, however, didn't respond with the same level of courtesy. Instead, he gave her a dismissive wave, as if her concern was unwarranted. "I'm fine," he snapped, pulling his bag down with more force than necessary. The action caused a bottle of red wine tucked inside to tip over, spilling its contents onto the plush beige carpet below. The sight of the spreading stain immediately drew gasps from nearby passengers. One woman seated across the aisle leaned forward, visibly annoyed. "Really?" she exclaimed, shaking her head. "This is why I pay extra to fly first class, to avoid this kind of mess." Other passengers murmured in agreement, their voices tinged with frustration. The once peaceful atmosphere had now shifted into something more tense and uncomfortable. Sarah quickly sprang into action, grabbing napkins and a small cleaning kit from the galley. She knelt beside the spill, trying to mop it up as efficiently as possible. Meanwhile, Carl stood frozen for a moment, looking both embarrassed and defensive. When he finally spoke, his voice carried an edge of irritation. "It was an accident," he muttered, almost defensively. "These things happen." "Yes, accidents happen," Sarah replied calmly, still focused on cleaning the spill. "But we ask all our passengers to exercise caution, especially in such close quarters. This carpet is expensive, and these stains can be hard to remove." Her words were measured, designed to diffuse the situation rather than escalate it. Yet they seemed to have the opposite effect on Carl. He crossed his arms and let out an audible sigh, clearly growing impatient. "You're making a big deal out of nothing," he said, raising his voice slightly. "I already said it was an accident. Are you going to lecture me now?" His tone caught the attention of several passengers who began whispering among themselves. Some sympathized with Carl, thinking the reaction might be overly dramatic, while others sided with Sarah, believing that basic courtesy should always apply, even in first class. Sensing the growing unrest, Sarah straightened up and addressed Carl directly. "Sir, I'm not lecturing you," she said, her voice steady despite the rising tension. "I'm simply reminding you of the importance of being careful in shared spaces. We're here to make sure everyone has a pleasant flight, and that includes keeping the cabin clean and comfortable for everyone." Carl scoffed, shaking his head. "Comfortable? You call this comfortable?" He gestured vaguely around the cabin, though it was clear he wasn't referring to the physical environment. "I've been treated like a criminal since I got on this plane. First, you hassle me about my seat, and now this? Maybe I shouldn't have upgraded to first class if this is how I'm going to be treated." His comment struck a nerve, not just with Sarah but also with some of the other passengers. A man sitting 2 rows away chimed in, his voice laced with sarcasm. "Yeah, because reclining your seat all the way back and spilling wine everywhere is totally justified behavior." His remark elicited a few chuckles from those nearby, further fueling Carl's irritation. Feeling cornered and judged, Carl shot back, "Oh, great. Now I'm getting attacked by random strangers too? Is this what I paid thousands of dollars for?" His voice rose louder, drawing even more attention. By now, nearly everyone in first class was watching the exchange unfold, their expressions ranging from amusement to discomfort. Even the flight crew stationed in the galley exchanged worried glances, sensing that the situation was spiraling out of control. Sarah knew she needed to act quickly. Ignoring Carl's outburst, she turned to the passenger who had complained earlier. "Ma'am, I apologize for the inconvenience," she said sincerely. "We'll make sure this area is thoroughly cleaned as soon as possible." Then turning back to Carl, she added, "Sir, perhaps it would be best if you return to your seat so we can resolve this peacefully." Her words were calm and professional, but Carl interpreted them as patronizing. "I don't need you telling me what to do," he retorted, his patience wearing thin. "If anything, you should be apologizing to me. I've done nothing wrong, yet I'm being treated like some kind of troublemaker." At this point, the tension in the cabin was palpable. Passengers whispered amongst themselves, speculating about what might happen next. Would Carl calm down, or would the confrontation escalate further? Sarah, determined to maintain order, took a deep breath and reminded herself of her training. She couldn't afford to lose her cool, not at 35,000 feet where emotions ran high and tempers flared easily. "Sir," she began again, her voice firmer this time. "We value your presence on board, and we're committed to ensuring your comfort. However, we also expect all passengers to adhere to basic guidelines for mutual respect and safety. If you continue to disrupt the cabin, I'll have no choice but to involve the captain." It was a bold statement, one she hoped wouldn't come to fruition. But given Carl's increasingly confrontational attitude, she felt it was necessary to set boundaries. For a brief moment, Carl hesitated. His expression softened slightly, as if he realized he might have gone too far. But pride, or perhaps something deeper, kept him from backing down completely. "Fine," he said gruffly, returning to his seat. "But don't think this is over." Though the immediate crisis appeared to subside, the damage had already been done. The harmony of the first-class cabin had been disrupted, replaced by an awkward silence punctuated only by the hum of the engines outside. Sarah finished cleaning the spill and discreetly signaled to her colleagues that everything was under control for now. Yet as she resumed her duties, she couldn't shake the feeling that this incident was far from resolved. Little did she know, the real drama was yet to unfold. The tension in the cabin lingered like a storm cloud, heavy and unrelenting. Though Carl had returned to his seat after the wine spill incident, the atmosphere remained charged. Passengers who had been chatting amiably earlier now spoke in hushed tones, their eyes darting toward Carl whenever they thought he wasn't looking. Some were curious, others judgmental, but all were aware that something unusual was unfolding. For Sarah, the pressure mounted with each passing minute. She knew she couldn't let the situation fester. Unresolved conflicts in the air could escalate quickly, especially on long flights where tempers often frayed. As the plane cruised smoothly through the sky, Sarah made her rounds, checking on passengers and offering refills of coffee or water. When she reached Carl's row, she paused briefly, mustering her most professional smile. "Is there anything else I can get for you, sir?" she asked, her voice steady despite the knot of anxiety tightening in her chest. Carl glanced up at her, his expression unreadable. For a moment it seemed like he might ignore her altogether, but then he shook his head curtly. "No," he said flatly, his tone dismissive. "I'm fine." Sarah nodded and moved on, though she couldn't shake the feeling that Carl's simmering frustration was far from resolved. He sat stiffly in his seat, staring out the window, his jaw clenched as if he were replaying the earlier confrontation in his mind. Every so often he would shift uncomfortably, his movements sharp and deliberate as though trying to release pent-up energy. It was clear to anyone watching that he was still upset, and perhaps even angrier than before. Meanwhile, the murmurs among the other passengers continued. The woman whose legs had been pressed against Carl's reclined seat leaned over to her companion and whispered, "Do you think he's always like this? Or is it just today?" Her companion shrugged, replying, "Who knows? Maybe he's used to getting his way everywhere he goes." Another passenger chimed in quietly, "Well, he's certainly not acting like someone who paid for first class." These whispered conversations didn't go unnoticed by Carl. Even though no one directly confronted him, he could feel the weight of their stares and hear the faint hum of disapproval. Each sideways glance felt like a jab, and every muffled comment stoked his indignation further. To him, it wasn't just about the spilled wine or the reclined seat. It was about being singled out, judged, and treated unfairly. And while part of him recognized that he might have handled things differently, pride kept him from backing down or apologizing. Back in the galley, Sarah conferred with her colleagues. "He's still upset," she admitted, keeping her voice low so the passengers wouldn't overhear. "I don't know what else to do. If he keeps this up, it could ruin the experience for everyone." One of the junior flight attendants suggested offering him a complimentary drink or dessert as a peace gesture. Another recommended giving him space and hoping he'd calm down on his own. But Sarah knew neither option was foolproof. Offering a perk might come across as rewarding bad behavior, while ignoring him entirely risked letting the tension boil over. Her instincts told her to tread carefully. Yet, just as she was about to step back into the cabin, another issue arose. A flight attendant stationed near the front reported that Carl had begun pacing again, this time muttering under his breath loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, shaking his head. "They act like I'm some kind of criminal, unbelievable." His words carried a mix of anger and disbelief, drawing more attention from those around him. Passengers exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of how to react. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats while others pretended not to notice. But one man, a middle-aged businessman seated 2 rows ahead, decided to speak up. Turning slightly in his seat, he addressed Carl directly. "Excuse me, sir," he said, his tone polite but firm. "We're all trying to enjoy our flight here. Maybe you could try to keep your voice down?" Carl stopped mid-pace, his eyes narrowing as he processed the request. For a moment it seemed like he might comply, but instead he shot back, "Oh sure, because I'm the only one causing problems here, right?" His sarcasm dripped heavily, and several passengers visibly recoiled at the escalation. The businessman raised his hands defensively, clearly not wanting to engage further. "Hey, I'm just saying," he trailed off, leaving the sentence unfinished. By now, the entire cabin seemed to hold its collective breath. Even the flight crew, stationed, discreet divider. The tension in the cabin had reached a boiling point, and Sarah knew she couldn't delay taking action any longer. Passengers were growing visibly uncomfortable, glancing nervously at Carl as he continued to pace and mutter under his breath. The businessman who had spoken up earlier now buried himself in his laptop, clearly regretting his attempt to intervene. Others shifted uneasily in their seats, some whispering behind cupped hands while others simply stared straight ahead, hoping to avoid drawing attention. The once luxurious first-class cabin now felt like a powder keg ready to explode. Sarah took a deep breath, mentally running through her training for handling difficult situations. She knew that safety and order were her top priorities, not just for Carl but for everyone on board. Approaching him again, she kept her expression calm and professional despite the storm brewing inside her. "Sir," she said firmly yet respectfully, "I need to ask you to return to your seat and remain there until we resolve this situation." Her tone left no room for negotiation, though she softened it slightly by adding, "We're here to ensure everyone has a safe and comfortable flight." Carl turned to face her, his frustration evident in the way his shoulders tensed and his jaw tightened. For a moment he looked like he might argue or refuse outright, but then something shifted in his demeanor. Instead of shouting or lashing out, he let out a bitter laugh. "You've got to be kidding me," he said, shaking his head. "This is unbelievable. I'm being treated like some kind of criminal because I spilled a little wine and stood up. Is this really what flying first class has come to?" His words carried an edge of sarcasm, but they also revealed a deeper layer of resentment. To Carl, this wasn't just about the incidents themselves. It was about feeling singled out, judged, and disrespected. He had paid a premium price for his ticket, expecting luxury and respect, only to find himself at odds with both the crew and fellow passengers. And while part of him recognized that he might have contributed to the tension, pride kept him from backing down. Sarah didn't flinch. She met his gaze steadily, refusing to let his anger intimidate her. "Sir, I understand you're upset," she replied, choosing her words carefully. "But your behavior is disrupting the cabin and making other passengers uncomfortable. If you continue to act this way, I'll have no choice but to involve the captain." It was a bold statement, one she hoped wouldn't come to fruition. Still, she needed to set clear boundaries to prevent the situation from spiraling further out of control. For a moment, Carl seemed to consider her warning. His eyes darted around the cabin, taking in the faces of the passengers who were now watching intently. Some looked sympathetic toward him, perhaps seeing him as a victim of overzealous rules, while others appeared annoyed, blaming him for ruining the peace. Whatever Carl saw in those expressions seemed to harden his resolve. Rather than calming down, he crossed his arms defiantly. "Go ahead," he challenged, his voice rising slightly. "Call the captain. Maybe he can explain why I'm being harassed for no reason." The challenge hung in the air, heavy and loaded. Sarah hesitated for a fraction of a second before nodding. Curtly, "Very well, sir," she said, maintaining her composure. Turning on her heel, she walked briskly toward the cockpit, her mind racing. She hated escalating situations like this. It went against everything she believed about customer service, but sometimes there was no other option. As she disappeared behind the curtain separating the cabin from the flight deck, whispers erupted among the passengers. "He's going too far," one woman whispered to her companion. "I mean, sure, maybe the staff could have handled things better, but he's the one causing all the drama." Her friend nodded in agreement. "Honestly, I don't care how much money you spend. If you act like that, you deserve to get kicked out of first class." Not everyone shared this opinion, however. A few passengers quietly defended Carl, suggesting that the airline's policies and the crew's approach might have played a role in escalating the conflict. "It sounds like they've been picking on him since he got on the plane," one man murmured to his wife. "No wonder he's mad. Imagine paying thousands of dollars for a ticket and still getting treated like a nuisance." As the debate raged softly in the background, Sarah returned with the captain, a tall man with a commanding presence and a reassuring smile. The captain introduced himself to Carl, extending a hand that Carl reluctantly shook. "Sir, I understand. There's been some difficulty," the captain began, his tone calm and measured. "Can you tell me what's going on?" Carl wasted no time launching into a passionate recounting of the events, painting himself as the aggrieved party. According to him, the flight attendants had been unnecessarily strict, the other passengers overly critical, and the entire experience thoroughly unpleasant. The captain listened patiently, nodding occasionally to show he understood Carl's perspective. When Carl finished, the captain turned to Sarah, who provided her side of the story. She recounted the reclined seat incident, the wine spill, and Carl's increasingly disruptive behavior, emphasizing that her actions had been aimed at ensuring the comfort and safety of all passengers. After hearing both sides, the captain sighed, deeply, clearly aware of the delicate balance he needed to strike. "Sir," the captain said finally, addressing Carl, "we value your business and appreciate your patience during this flight. However, your behavior has caused significant disruption in the cabin, and we must prioritize the well-being of all our passengers. With that in mind, I'm going to ask you to move to economy class for the remainder of the journey." The words hit Carl like a punch to the gut. His face flushed red with a mix of embarrassment and rage, and for a moment, it seemed like he might explode. "You've got to be joking," he spat, his voice trembling with indignation. "Move me to economy, over a spilled drink and a reclined seat? This is absurd." Several passengers craned their necks to watch the exchange, eager to see how it would play out. The captain remained calm, his expression unwavering. "I assure you, sir, this decision isn't made lightly. But given the circumstances, it's the best course of action to ensure a safe and pleasant flight for everyone." Realizing there was no room for negotiation, Carl grabbed his carry-on bag and stormed toward the economy section, muttering under his breath the entire way. As he passed through the aisle, some passengers averted their eyes, while others stared openly, curiosity etched across their faces. One young woman whispered to her seatmate, "Isn't that Vin Diesel's stepdad?" The comment rippled through the cabin like a quiet shockwave, prompting a flurry of hushed conversations. But before anyone could confirm or act on this revelation, Carl disappeared into the back of the plane, leaving behind a trail of stunned silence. With Carl gone, the first-class cabin slowly began to relax. Passengers exchanged relieved smiles, grateful that the tension had finally eased. Sarah returned to her duties, refilling drinks and checking on passengers, though her thoughts lingered on what had just transpired. She couldn't help but wonder, if she had handled things differently, whether the situation could have ended without such drama. Little did she, or anyone else, know, the fallout from this incident was only beginning. The moment Carl disappeared into the economy section, a collective sigh of relief swept through the first-class cabin. Passengers who had been gripping their armrests or exchanging nervous glances finally relaxed, some even laughing softly at the absurdity of what had just unfolded. One woman quipped under her breath, "Well, that was certainly memorable," earning a few chuckles from those nearby. For Sarah and the rest of the flight crew, however, the tension hadn't fully dissipated. They knew that moving Carl to economy class wasn't the end of the story. It was merely a temporary solution, one that might come with its own set of challenges. Back in the galley, Sarah leaned against the counter, taking a rare moment to catch her breath. Her hands trembled slightly as she poured herself a cup of water, though she tried to hide it from her colleagues. She replayed the events in her mind, dissecting every interaction with Carl, wondering if there was anything she could have done differently. Had she been too harsh? Too accommodating? The questions swirled in her head like turbulence outside, the plane leaving her unsettled. Her thoughts were interrupted by a junior flight attendant named Mia, who approached hesitantly. "Sarah," Mia whispered, her voice tinged with urgency. "You know who that guy is, right?" Sarah frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" she asked. Mia glanced around to make sure no passengers were listening before leaning in closer. "That's Vin Diesel's stepdad," she said, her eyes wide with disbelief. "I heard someone mention it earlier when he walked past." For a split second, Sarah froze, the words hitting her like a jolt of electricity. Vin Diesel, the action star whose movies dominated box offices worldwide, wasn't just a celebrity, he was a cultural icon. And now she had just removed his stepfather from first class. The realization sent a wave of dread crashing over her. What would happen when Vin found out? Would he take to social media to call out the airline? Or worse, would he demand accountability for how his family member had been treated? Word spread quickly among the flight crew, each whisper amplifying the gravity of the situation. A senior attendant named James pulled Sarah aside, his expression serious. "We need to handle this carefully," he said, his voice low but firm. "If this gets out, and trust me it will, we're going to have a PR nightmare on our hands. People love Vin Diesel. If he feels slighted, it could blow up in ways we can't control." Sarah nodded numbly, her mind racing. She had always prided herself on maintaining professionalism, but this was uncharted territory. Dealing with an ordinary difficult passenger was one thing. Dealing with someone connected to a global superstar was entirely different. Meanwhile, in the economy section, Carl fumed quietly, stewing in his humiliation. He had taken a seat near the back of the plane, far away from the luxurious comforts of first class. The cramped quarters and lack of personal space only fueled his resentment. Other passengers in economy eyed him curiously, some recognizing him from the earlier commotion while others simply noticed his imposing presence. Carl ignored them all, choosing instead to scroll through his phone, muttering under his breath about entitled staff and terrible customer service. As the hours ticked by, Carl grew increasingly agitated. He couldn't stop thinking about how unfairly he'd been treated, or so he believed. To him, the incident wasn't just about being moved to economy class. It was symbolic of a larger issue. He saw himself as a paying customer who had been disrespected and dismissed, his dignity stripped away in front of dozens of strangers. And as someone accustomed to wielding influence due to his connection to Vin Diesel, the indignity of the situation stung even more sharply. Unable to contain his frustration, Carl decided to vent online. Pulling out his phone, he logged into his social media account and began typing. Within minutes, he posted a scathing update. "Just got kicked out of first class on airline name because I dared to recline my seat and spill a little wine. Oh, and did I mention they made me sit in economy? Unbelievable treatment for a loyal customer. Maybe a VF Diesel should weigh in on how his favorite airline treats family members. Customer service fail." The post went live just as the plane entered its final descent toward London. At first, it garnered only a handful of likes and comments, mostly from friends and acquaintances offering sympathy. But within hours, the tweet exploded. Fans of Vin Diesel flooded the comment section, many expressing outrage on Carl's behalf. Some defended the airline, arguing that disruptive behavior shouldn't be tolerated regardless of who you are. Others speculated wildly about why Carl had been moved, creating memes and jokes that quickly gained traction across platforms. By the time the plane landed, Carl's post had gone viral, attracting the attention of entertainment news outlets and travel bloggers alike. Headlines like "Flight Attendant Removes Vin Diesel's Stepdad from First Class" dominated feeds, sparking debates about privilege, customer service, and the ethics of removing passengers mid-flight. Reporters scrambled to reach representatives from the airline for comment, while fans bombarded Vin Diesel's official accounts with messages asking for his take on the situation. Back at the airline's headquarters, executives watched the unfolding drama with growing alarm. Social media teams worked overtime to monitor the backlash, drafting statements and strategizing responses. Meanwhile, the flight crew disembarked in London, unaware of the full extent of the storm brewing online. Sarah, exhausted from the long flight and emotionally drained from the confrontation, simply wanted to go home and forget about the day's events. But as she scrolled through her phone during her layover, she realized that wouldn't be possible. Notifications poured in, alerting her to articles, tweets, and videos discussing the incident, and naming her as the central figure. Her heart sank as she read comment after comment dissecting her actions. Some praised her for standing her ground and prioritizing passenger safety, while others criticized her for allegedly mishandling the situation. The mixed reactions left her feeling torn between pride in her professionalism and guilt over the unintended consequences. She knew the airline would likely face scrutiny, but she never imagined the spotlight would shine so brightly on her personally. As the hours passed, the story continued to evolve. Passengers from the flight began sharing their perspectives, posting photos and videos they had discreetly taken during the incident. These first-hand accounts painted a complex picture. with opinions divided on whether Carl or the airline was truly at fault. Amidst the chaos, one thing became clear. The fallout from this single flight would ripple far beyond the confines of the airplane, touching lives and reputations in ways no one could have anticipated. For Sarah, the weight of responsibility settled heavily on her shoulders. She had always believed in doing what was right, even when it was difficult. Now faced with the reality of public judgment and potential repercussions, she wondered if she had truly done enough, or if the cost of upholding standards had been too high. Little did she know, the resolution to this saga would require not just accountability but also empathy and understanding from all sides.